It's,
So some of this stuff I can do, but not that. I've done the statistics, so I know something about the statistics. But good morning, everyone. Good morning. We are getting into extrasensory perception and other wonderful topics today. Let me just put this.
Send out.
I'm just putting out a little headline for today's session. Oh wow, 5 people joined while I was doing that. So welcome. It's going to be an interesting day. And I'm sorry I didn't send out a notice today. Maybe I should do that.
Yeah. I just noticed an email from Miles that he was talking. He's on the list, so if you send that out, he'll get it.
Okay. All right. So Miles, if you are there, I'm going to send out the notice now. And meanwhile, let's see what I'm going to do. This new tab. All right. So Jordan, you disappeared.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to shut up and let you read the first paragraph and see what you can do with it. And while I'm doing this notice here. Okay.
We are
on 825 is the number.
Yeah, that's where 825, paragraph 825. Kammerer holds that through, in quotes, runs or successions of chance events are not subject to the operation of a common cause, i.e. are acausal. They are nevertheless an expression of inertia, the property of persistence. And the footnote here, important to read, the law of series is an expression of the inertia of the objects involved in its repetitions, in essence, producing the series. The far greater inertia of a complex of objects and forces, as compared to that of a single object or force, explains the persistence of an identical constellation and the emergence connected therewith of repetitions over long periods of time. The simultaneity of a, in quotes, run of the same thing side by side, he explains as, in quotes, imitation. Here he contradicts himself, for the run of chance has not been, in quotes, removed outside the realm of the explicable, but as we would expect, is included within it and is consequently reducible, if not to a common cause, then at least to several causes. His concepts of seriality, imitation, attraction, and inertia belong to a causally conceived view of the world and tell us no more than that the run of chance corresponds to statistical and mathematical probability. Kammerer's factual material contains nothing but runs of chance whose only, in quotes, law is probability. In other words, there is no apparent reason why he should look behind them for anything else. But for some obscure reason, he does look behind them for something more than mere probability warrants, for a law of seriality, which he would like to introduce as a principle coexistent with a causality and finality. This tendency, as I have said, is in no way justified by his material. I can only explain this obvious contradiction by supposing that he had a dim but fascinated intuition of an acausal arrangement and combination of events, probably because, like all thoughtful and sensitive natures, he could not escape the peculiar impression which runs of chance usually make on us, and therefore, in accordance with his scientific disposition, took the bold step of postulating an acausal seriality on the basis of empirical material that lay within the limits of probability. Unfortunately, he did not attempt a quantitative evaluation of seriality. Such an undertaking would undoubtedly have thrown up questions that are difficult to answer. The investigation of individual cases serves well enough for the purpose of general orientation, but only quantitative evaluation or the statistical method promises results in dealing with chance.
Do you have any hope of saying anything about that?
Well, I think he's just playing tennis back and forth with what Kammerer did and then did further, and then why he did it, and then why he did further, and then, oh, there's something that I can't see that's there, so I'll try to explain it further. I think if I simplify the geometric proof of the words, and so it feels like a really long paragraph just about Kammerer's the history of this particular process. I think I should go ahead and read 826 because he's playing, I think, fine-grained minutia with what Kammerer was doing. Obviously, with Jung, he'll set something up like this, and then we'll get a meaty paragraph, because that just feels to be a back and forth. He said this because kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, I mean, thoughts?
Well, that is kind of what he's doing. He's sort of debating with Kammerer, and he does that with a number of people here. But go ahead, do what you can so I can get this out, and then I'll come back to you.
Okay, yeah, because he does feel like the cat just kind of batting the mouse around a little bit without going at it. Chance groupings or series seem, at least to our present way of thinking, to be meaningless and to fall as a general rule within the limits of probability. There are, however, incidents whose chancefulness seems open to doubt. To mention but one example out of many, I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday. We have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone. That same morning, I made a note of an inscription which read, Est homo totus medius piscis ab imo. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, who I had not seen for months, showed me some extremely impressive pictures of fish, which she had painted in the meantime. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish-like sea monsters in it. On the morning of April 2nd, another patient, whom I had not seen for many years, told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this time engaged on a study of the fish symbol in history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. I feel that there's what I call yellow car syndrome going on here. And to clarify that, back in 2004, 2004, 2005, 2004, I went to buy a new car. And I walked into the dealership, and there was this tiny little Chevy Aveo. It looks like a little Euro trash kind of car, but it was sunflower yellow. And I just went, that one, does it have a 5-speed? Okay, I don't care. It's a little bitty tiny, probably 120 horsepower, maybe, probably more like 90. But it just, looked so amazing, literally like a sunflower. I found out later that I needed to keep the windows closed at intersections because bees would fly in. And just because I think they're coming to a huge flower. But I will swear that there were no yellow cars on the road. Yellow cars probably didn't even exist when I was driving to the dealership. But after I left the dealership, there must have been 50 yellow cars on the road. So in that sense, with him and the fish, working on the fish, until I saw the yellow car and bought it, they didn't exist. And then they were everywhere. So in that sense, I wasn't capable of seeing yellow cars until I saw that one. So I'm wondering, I mean, here with the fish, if we cataloged any activities across a couple of days with nouns and topics that are in them, how many groups, would have the same thing, but except whatever we were focused on would be the only thing that we would take note of. And it feels like in this paragraph.
Well, that's a part of it, but let us explain. First of all, explain how synchronicity works in a big picture kind of way, because let's see, we're on paragraph 825, Susan.
I just read 826.
Yeah, let's talk about synchronicity in a big picture kind of way before we get into extrasensory perception, because there's definitely something there which Dr. Jung really gets into, and which Debbie and I have experienced big time. Okay,
probably page 10.
Just a minute, Susan. Look for the paragraph that begins, camera holds that through runs or successions. Okay, that's the paragraph we're on. Camera holds through runs or successions. Okay, now what happens is we have unconscious hooks in our psyche, which we don't know about because they're unconscious. But something will happen in our life, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 all these things happen. So in the example that Dr. Jung gives here about all the fish showing up in his life on one day, he was sensitized to it after one or two things happen, and then another fish happens, and the probability of it is very low, and yet he, because he's thinking about fish, picks up on the fish symbol, and right. And then another one will show up, and another one will show up. So it's kind of like Jordan's idea about the yellow car syndrome, which is, a lot of these things we don't even notice on a day-to-day basis. And then all of a sudden, because you're thinking about yellow cars, boom, 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 you see yellow cars everywhere. And, we had the same experience with red cars. We have a red car now, not because it's a political statement, but because we like red. And because the book, The Radiant Sutras, has a red cover. So we decided to call this car Radiance. And so that's the reference to our red in that case. Synchronicities do occur, and they're meaningful only possibly to you. I mean, if you go into my video in which I talk about finding the living God, that's the name of that video on this YouTube channel. If you go to that YouTube video, you will find many synchronicities that I happen to have caught on video or in still imagery that are unexplainable. They just are not explainable. For example, I was reading Answer to Job, and all of a sudden, the flight of F-18s flew over my house. Well, hadn't been thinking about that consciously. But of course, I would have known, living in Annapolis, that on that particular Saturday, there was a home football game. And the F-18s from Oceana, which is a naval air station down in Virginia Beach, the F-18s come up every home game and do a flyover the Naval Academy Stadium, and it's meant to intimidate the opposition. And it happens every time there's a home game. But I wasn't thinking about that. But then when I was reading Answer to Job, boom, they came over at just the right moment between two paragraphs. And it was uncanny. You could not possibly have planned it. Even if you knew that the jets were going to fly over, and if you knew I was going to be reading Answer to Job that day, you would not be able to predict to the second exactly the right moment for those planes to fly over. But nonetheless, they did at that exact moment. And so that is probably one of two most amazing synchronicities of my life, because nobody could have possibly predicted that. Nobody could have possibly planned it, and yet it happened. And so go ahead, Jordan.
I was going to say, just with that example too, even the concept of, reasons are unreasonable is too much reason, where the acausal piece is that they are simply naturally present at that moment, and they've literally synchronized, the synchronicity, where those things came together in parallel at a moment, whether they're crossing paths or whether they're moving together to move apart. I mean, there could be apogee and perigee and orbits, but the reasons are all unreasonable. They become meaningful because we noticed the synchronization, like a clutch and a gear, and then it takes us forward. And so rather than a reason, it feels like an instant motivation. So it feels like synchronicities, to me, have always induced verbs where I didn't need to think about it anymore. And I could look at that and go, well, let's write it.
Right. And I have synchronicities in my life every day these days. But that particular one, those jets were going to fly over at that time, no matter what. And I was going to be reading Answer to Job, no matter what. And it's only me, because I know something about Jungian psychology, that even puts two and two together. And you can see it in the video, because I'm reading along, the jets fly over, I make some comments about Go Navy, and then as I continue to read, it suddenly starts to dawn on me how remarkable this synchronicity is. And within another 2 minutes, you can see me literally lose it, where I start to weep, because I say, wow, this was an act of God, pretty much. Now, to anybody else, it might not be, because, that only comes because of my affinity to the Naval Academy, my affinity to the Blue Angels, my affinity to Navy football. All those things are there in my psyche. And then when that connection comes, it's mainly happening to me. If it had happened to Jordan at exactly the same moment, it might not have affected him so much, but it affected me because of my personal life history around F-18s, the Naval Academy, et cetera. I mean, just to give you another aside here, one of the midshipmen that I sponsored at the Naval Academy became an F-18 pilot, and he always intended to be an F-18 pilot. He came to the Naval Academy when he was 19 years old. He already had his pilot's license, and He intended to be an F-18 pilot. He became it. And today he's deployed as a squadron commander of an F-18 squadron in the Western Pacific today. And so he and his wife are assigned to Iwakuni, Japan, which is it's actually a Marine Corps air station, but it's where his squadron is home ported when the ship is in port, because the airplanes don't stay on the aircraft carrier when it goes into port. They fly off and fly to a land base where they can be maintained properly. And so about 2 weeks ago, and my wife and I, Debbie and I, both have long experience with Japan. I lived there 8 years of my life. Debbie 3 years, but she speaks beautiful Japanese women's language. And about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I suppose, we got a care package from this couple who we've been very close to since 1998. We went to their wedding in North Dakota. All kinds of things have happened with them. And so in this care package, there was an American flag, and with it was and they've been telling us about having gone to climb Mount Fuji with their little kids and finding out what a challenge that was. But in any case, there was a bottle of volcanic ash there. And so I originally thought that this bottle of volcanic ash was from their Fuji trip, that they had actually taken a piece of Mount Fuji, which is a crime actually in Japan. You're not allowed to take any of Mount Fuji with you. And
kind of like Hawaii.
Yeah, so I'm reading this letter, and it turns out that this flag is a flag that the U.S. Navy has an arrangement to fly it over Suribachi, which is the volcano on Iwo Jima, which the Marines liberated during World War II. And I have lots of connections with Suribachi because, for example, in 1969, I was the youngest Marine officer at the headquarters battalion birthday ball, and the oldest officer who came up on the stage with me to receive the first piece of birthday cake. I received the second piece as the youngest Marine. The oldest officer was General Vandegrift, who had been the commanding general of the Iwo Jima invasion. And so anyway, here's this package of volcanic dust, and it turns out that came from Iwo Jima also. So this guy that I had sponsored in the Naval Academy had sent me this beautiful American flag with the piece of Suribachi in it and a beautiful certificate in my name saying that this flag was flown over Suribachi for Lieutenant Colonel Donald L. Conover, blah, blah, blah. And so, but then he said, and I flew this flag on my last sortie over Afghanistan last year. And as you see, that combination of facts is quite emotional for me. I have to find a way of properly displaying this, because here's a flag folded triangularly in the custom, which is flown both over Suribachi and over Afghanistan. And this young man who's now a squadron commander, so he's the equivalent of Tom Skerritt in the first Top Gun movie,
Mhm.
flew that flag on his mission, especially for me. I just can't tell you how touched I felt by that.
What's interesting is the synchronicity. Growing up in Wichita Falls, Texas, Shepherd Air Force Base, it not any longer, but it used to be that every Air Force pilot that went through any kind of the training, every single one, the only consistency was everyone had to go to Shepherd Air Force Base. I never knew why, but we would always watch the night maneuvers, and you'd see the lights, and the light would go off on one plane, but you didn't see it on the other, and so the guy was evading. And I always, when that happened, it was a magnet. Everything in my life stopped, and I looked up and watched them. So that you have those pieces. I'm on much lower level here, but you had all those pieces come together, and it's just emotion poured into emotion, poured into emotion. It literally, I don't want to be clever, but it's like an ocean, emotion ocean. I mean, you're being tossed about in this wonderful collection of things that occurred. That's a precious gift.
Right. And at the time, 3 weeks ago, I also thought that Mike Mansfield, who had been the Senate Majority Leader for many years, had retired, and but I knew that he had been a Marine, and I had been told a story, which the last couple of days I learned was apocryphal, but I had been told a story that Mike Mansfield had been a private landing on Iwo Jima. And while I was in Japan in 1983, a friend of mine, we were both majors in Marine Corps Reserve, and so we were actively serving with an Army unit so that we could get reserve retirement points. And we decided we wanted to go to the Marine Corps birthday ball. And so we invited the Master Sergeant, who was the head of the Marine Security Guard detachment, which was 21 Marines. Total of 21 Marines are the security guard for the embassy. Okay, so this Master Sergeant, we invited him out to lunch, and we took him to the American Club, gave him a nice time, and said, well, we'd like an invitation to the birthday ball. And he, after a beautiful lunch, he very callously said, nothing doing, you can't come. And meanwhile, Chris Tibbs and I, who was the other major, took that in. And then on the night of the birthday ball, it so happened that we knew where it was. And so we both dressed in our dress blues, our wives dressed to the nines, and it was in the NCR building in Tokyo. So the way it was set up was at the top of the elevator, the place where on the floor where the ball was, all the Marines were set up in a receiving line. And so the elevator would open, and there you were in the receiving line. So here Chris and I are dressed to the nines in our major uniforms, and we both had Bronze Stars and so on. And Vietnam was much closer in those days. And so we step off the elevator, and here's a Lance Corporal who's the first in line for the receiving line. And so he greets us and passes us on down the receiving line. And it took a while for the top to even realize we were physically there. And we went all the way through the receiving line. And then someone came over and asked us if we'd be willing to pay for our dinners. And we said, of course we would. And it turned out that night, and mind you, 3 weeks ago, I thought Mike Mansfield had been in the first group that had invaded Iwo Jima. Mike Mansfield was the oldest Marine present. But then the last couple of days, I wanted to check that out. And so I read the history of Mike Mansfield, who was a senator from Montana, of course. And his exploits were even more awesome because during World War I, he had joined the Navy at age 14, and he had actually been deployed to Westpac 3 times. And then the Navy found out how old he was, and they washed him out. So he joined the Army, and the Army found out how old he was and washed him out. So then he joined the Marines. And in 1922, when he was 15 years old, he got washed out of the Marine Corps too after he had been deployed to Westpac once. And because he kept signing up for these various military organizations when he was underage. And so he was definitely the oldest Marine in the room. But by the time World War II came along, he was actually in Congress. And so he wasn't on the invasion of Iwo Jima, but I mean that synchronicity was there in my mind too, which wasn't true, but there was enough of a synchronicity besides that. So anyway, go ahead.
It sounds like he wasn't there in the party to invade Iwo Jima, but it sounds like he invaded every other part of the military.
Well, and plus that's right, and plus he was the longest serving American ambassador to Japan. He was appointed by Jimmy Carter. He was reappointed by Ronald Reagan, and he served for 12 years as the ambassador to Japan. And there was never anybody that was any better than him in that role. And this is after he had been Senate Majority Leader. So anyway, he was an amazing guy. Okay, we're at the end of what paragraph now? What
I just finished reading 826.
Okay, I'll read 827. The suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, i.e. an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to me to have a certain numinous quality. In such circumstances, we are inclined to say that cannot be mere chance, without knowing what exactly we are saying. Kammerer would, no doubt, have reminded me of his seriality principle. The strength of an impression, however, proves nothing against the fortuitous coincidence of all these fishes. It is admittedly exceedingly odd that the fish theme recurs no less than 6 times within 24 hours, but one must remember that fish on Friday is the usual thing, and on April 1st, one might very easily think of the April fish. I had at that time been working on the fish symbol for several months. Fishes frequently occur as symbols of unconscious contents. So there is no possible justification for seeing in this anything but a chance grouping. Runs or series which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences must for the present be regarded as fortuitous. However wide their range may be, they must be ruled out as acausal connections. It is therefore generally assumed that all coincidences are lucky hits and do not require an acausal interpretation. This assumption can, and indeed must, be regarded as true so long as proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. Should this proof be forthcoming, however, it would prove at the same time that there are genuinely non-causal combinations of events for whose explanation we should have to postulate a factor incommensurable with causality. We should then have to assume that events in general are related to one another on the one hand as causal chains, and on the other hand by a kind of meaningful cross connection. Okay, so what is the meaningful cross connection in this case of the fishes, or in my stories?
Well, in both of them is, I think, the unconscious welling up contents, because it is on its own theme. And just like Jung, I mean, his active diagram, not that he ever mentioned this, but his active diagram that I see of the yin yang symbol is when he says, like the glowing-eyed fish yanked from the dark depths. And
Right.
so there's the light in the dark, as it were. And then this fish is, to me, it's the unconscious plays thematics, or its own chapters, as it were. And in a sense, even though unconscious, it doesn't seem to have order. It does have characters that it tends to play in, like chords in music, as it were. There aren't discords. So the symbols that are coming up are here, all fishes. So that the meaningful cross connection is that the unconscious is welling up. And so it's going to well up across the board in a similar, consistent fashion, from my perspective.
Right.
Your thought?
And the acausal connection is in the human being. Okay. It's only if that human being is there at that moment and has those things come together all at one time, only then does this synchronicity occur. It doesn't occur just because these things are happening. There's stuff happening around us all the time in our lives, and it's also happening to all 8 billion other human beings around, and there's lots of things happening. But the synchronicity has its essence in the human being, where it all comes together and you say, oh my God, that is a synchronicity. It has to be, because it couldn't possibly have been predicted. Not possible.
Well, completely. And I think what's interesting, I always find if I use the word acausal, people kind of look at you because it's stone cold. It's almost too scientific, and what do you really mean, kind of thing. And to kind of make the word a little more accessible, I always say naturally present is acausal. It doesn't have a reason. It doesn't have literally a cause. It's just naturally present. So it's there. And then when you're swimming in it, you get it. I mean, if I'm swimming in Maui versus swimming in a lake in Texas or Colorado, I know the difference. I mean, there's a different theme for how it works.
Right. And the meaning comes from the human being. Now, Zen mode says the other element of synchronicity is meaning, right? Because the human being applies the meaning. The human being sees the meaning. And so synchronicities are actually happening to you every day. The question is whether you're sensitive enough to notice them and be aware of them. And if you are aware of them, then your life is enriched in actuality. And they're very powerful. They have huge meaning to you in terms of dealing with your own psyche. And, I'm not saying that they're all good or wonderful. I'm saying that there might be something that says you better stop what you're doing also. And so I just want to share with you, I've been substitute teaching, and I think I have it here. Yeah. Okay. I've been substitute teaching, and I've been mostly doing it in art classes intentionally, because I wanted to sort of prove a concept for Colleen Guibert about the doodle. And so this is not trying to draw anything specifically. And one of the steps in the doodle process is to ask people at their table to to draw something together as a collaborative project. And I just want to show this one piece that came up out of a group of 5th grade girls that really I found stunning, and I'll share it here. Now, okay, so this is a group of girls that are working together. They're in the 5th grade. They're minority students. And what do you see in this? You know, aside from what they called it.
Well, I see a dignity and difference. Nothing is eclipsing anything else, but everything is connecting. So there's no enmeshing, which is
what they were doing was passing it. One girl put the circles on, the interconnecting circles. Okay. She took a glass or something and put that on. Then I had them pass the paper to the next person, and then the next person, and then the next person. So all 4 of them produced this over a period of about 30 minutes. And so what else? What else?
To me, the intersection is such a dignity and difference between each piece. They all have their identities, but they're connected. And
right.
The connection is, to me, the strongest verb that's going through with this. And what's interesting is following the red, it starts in the top right and comes over here to the bottom. And starting at the bottom left, this deep blue ocean color. So, which is to me a different version of the life of the ocean. I mean, you get the color rather than the energy.
Right. And the lower left is what Colleen calls the creative source or wellspring, the creative wellspring. And so that's part of it. But what I see is that all 4 of these girls saw patterns, and yet they were putting other things into the patterns, and they all respected one another's patterns. And so it made me wonder, this looks like girls that have an affinity toward STEM, toward the science, technology, and math area, because they're all attracted to shapes and structure, whereas some of the students, a lot of the boys at that age are just scribbling across the page. They can't put anything together. And yet these 4 girls together stuck together. And so it made me wonder if these 4 kept together as a cohort over the next 8 years of their education, and then went on to college together. I wonder what they would produce in scientific discovery together.
That's interesting about the STEM too, because I just noticed the football, and there are both abstract and distinct things they put into these overlapping connection pieces. And I think the overall word to me is harmony. I mean, they've achieved a synchronicity, like synchro meshing gears. I mean, they're speed shifting, as it were, shifting without a clutch, and just smooth.
Right. And they walked into the class with a substitute, not having any idea what they would be doing in that half hour. And I just thought that was amazing piece. And there's one other piece that came out of a 3rd grade girl that I thought was really impressive. Let me share it with you. Okay, here it is. And I asked her to put a name on it, and she put the mysteries of the man on this. And so, pardon?
Mysteries of the man, you said?
Yeah, the mysteries of the man. And she also put on it, it's ugly, I take it. Well, what is amazingly beautiful in this is, do you see anything unusual about this picture, Jordan?
Well, these barbell eyes are striking, but
Okay, wait. I
wow.
mean, obviously, I'm there with a mustache, and so she's taking note of that, and then she lets the hairs of the mustache hang down, and what does it become? It becomes a second face. So
All right.
there's another set of eyes here, and a mouth that applies to both faces, actually,
Right.
and a nose even in the lower one. And the upper one is sort of whimsical, but the lower one is kind of sad, right? And so for this to come out of a third grader in about a half an hour is just an amazing piece to me, and I'm not sure she even thought of it. And Patrick says the black hole eyes, the fib. And Patrick Hollywood says, see, I am all about shapes. As I continue into code, I am applying my same ideas. There is a thing to it. Right. And he may be referring to the earlier one. But I just, all I did was introduce the doodle in both cases. In both cases, I said, draw a line, then draw a line that doesn't like other lines, and then keep going. And, once you've done that for a while, then work on your masterpiece. And so they came up with these masterpieces. And, for that third grade girl, I would say, wow, that is the start of a truly artistic fist kind of thing. It's kind of like the way Picasso would have been in the third grade, where all of that girl's work from now on, you will be able to recognize it. Right.
Well, and interesting, the face within the face, and then shapes within shapes, and shapes coming together to compose other shapes. It's like seeing a face in a tree. I mean, and then the sunlight changes and it goes away, but there's this connection to nature, I find, that really
Right.
works there.
Right.
About how everything is interwoven.
Right. Now, meanwhile, that really impressed me, and so I did a couple of doodles myself between classes, and so here's one that I did. I was impressed by the spiraling eyes, so I did this one, which I sort of meant as a self-portrait. And I didn't show this to any of the kids, but I thought it was interesting how it came up. And then there's another one which I don't have the full image here.
What's interesting, that one seemed to have Debbie's eyes.
Yeah, it could be. Could be. Here's the second one I did, but this is not the second one filled out. Yeah, I actually colored this in with colors, and what you see in this face is two people that are kind of ugly and are arguing with one another, and I thought that was quite interesting. And it's interesting that there's another set of eyes down here, which I hadn't planned. And so I had just done this doodle, and I kept doing it until I started to see imagery in it, and then I started to fill it in. So anyway, that's interesting. Just a side, it's a side topic, but also relates to the meaningful cross connection. And so that third grader's piece definitely connected with me. And I wanted to try her technique. And so I actually tried it during a couple of my planning periods, and it was fun. I'm going to do some more with it.
Well, and also what I think is interesting about bringing up the doodles there is the, what do you see in this ocean of a graphic or of a page? And when you see a face, or you see a football, and you see overlappages, you see harmony, you see all these things, but they're pretty specific. And so out of this doodle, as it were, order is birthed. So I mean, literally, that creative wellspring piece, it's interesting because people make the distinctions between different things that are actual things that are actually probably not even intended in the first place. So I think that it's interesting that how that the meaningful cross connections are then what is evoked by a doodle.
Yeah. And let's just see if I have an example of what the boys were producing. Well, I did get some good pieces from the boys, but also this one is very typical. And then, in this one, fall time, it's just all one color. But then these were interesting. These were two boys that did these two things, that one and that one. And then this was a good one. This is by a girl. And then this one was also interesting. It hadn't been built out. But this one was also cool, the cupcake with all the different colors in it. And then a cupcake came out of it. And then this is kind of interesting too. Also has potential if it was built out. And that was emotions, is what this child named it. So it was just very interesting to see what would come out of them, because I was insisting that they name their work of art, whatever they did on it. And some of them, especially among the boys, were just pure scribbles and kind of acting out kind of behavior. But some of them were very, very clear in terms of, aspects of their psychology. I'm going to try to impress upon the teacher that she pay serious attention to these pieces that she received. And I'm doing her class one more time tomorrow. So we're going to see how it works. I was not terribly, the behavior in these classes is not good, especially when they have a substitute. They just assume that they can get away with anything. And so there's a lot of yelling and screaming in the room. And it's kind of what you find at the Naval Academy. At the Naval Academy, for the first year students are required to shout "Go Navy" or "Beat Army" every time they turn a corner in the dormitory, which is Bancroft Hall. And that happens from morning till night. So although Bancroft Hall from the outside looks like this peaceful place that houses 4,000 people, actually it's bedlam from reveille to taps, and then it's quiet during the night. And the reason that we do that is it's a screening mechanism where if they can't handle that kind of bedlam, they're not going to be able to handle themselves in battle. And that's what I was reminded of in these classes, although it didn't bother me. It didn't really bother me at all. They were trying to get my goat, and I didn't care. So Zen Mode says, familiarity due to the mother's love and upbringing as well. They recognize the scent and size of the friendly circles, child's perspective and early development. Anders says, love is how art is like food for consciousness. Zen, again, Plato saying the original man where circled is deeply meaningful. Zen says, this is not a new phenomenon. No, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's very interesting phenomenon. Patrick likes the cupcake. The force is strong in these kids. Yes, very definitely. And Susan, the power of creative conversations. Interesting. I did not see a cupcake. I see a brain in the cupcake woods. And my mom kept some of my childhood drawings. One funny thing is when I was little, I would draw my family and make myself as large as my parents, all circles. Over time, my circle shrank as theirs grew. I was at the Naval Academy this past week. Well, you missed me then. You should have called. Got to go. Justin had to depart, and Anders said, I saw the brain too, not a cupcake. But
what's interesting to me in the big picture on those doodles is that even the ones acting out, instead of not being listened to, they can see instead themselves create something.
Yeah.
And so when they do that, it's like a lot of say INFJs. I mean, you don't have a lot of psychological modeling through your life.
Right.
And what's interesting is you learn not to sit and whine and moan, but you self-model. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm loving seeing the brain here.
Yeah. Well, now I see what is meant when they say, I see a brain. I see the brain there too now. And I also see the aura of this child, referring to an aura around the head. Mm-hmm. That's amazing also.
Yeah, where the whole thing's a face, and even the title was part of the nose.
Right. And Kathy says, good morning, gents and old friends.
Hey there. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I hadn't thought about this until this showing of doodles, that one thing that's important is that people can see themselves produce something, and they don't need to have a reason for it. They don't need to explain it. It doesn't have to be right or wrong or valuable or unvaluable. It's that they see they can self-model. They can create something that it's not even breaking the rules. There are no rules other than how they actually draw, and they can learn how they move and even how they think, notwithstanding what a teacher would want to see or a parent would want to see, and develop their own individuality by seeing the visual language that they doodle.
Right. So anyway, I'm doing the same group of classes, 2nd through 5th grade tomorrow, for the same teacher, although different kids. And so I'm going to see what further happens. But what I've found in the last 3.5 weeks is that you get very similar results, whether the kids are pre-K or 12th grade.
Right.
You get very similar results. Zen says, Jordan always has such good insight. I totally agree with that comment, although I never thought of it that way before. And Patrick says, cupcake and the brain could be considered the same thing. Cece, get it? Might not, but it's a thing. Oh yeah. Well, yes, I agree. And thank you, Kathy, for your comment about sharing our hearts. But anyway, it's been an exciting experiment, and I'm going to be continuing it through at least for most of this year, although I may take a 2nd grade in December
Surely. Here I should like to draw attention to a treatise of Schopenhauer's on the apparent design and the fate of the individual, which originally stood godfather to the views I am now developing. It deals with the simultaneity of the causally unconnected, which we call, in quotes, chance. Schopenhauer illustrates this simultaneity by a geographical analogy where the parallels represent the cross connection between the meridians, which are thought of as causal chains. All of the events in a man's life would accordingly stand in two fundamentally different kinds of connection. Firstly, in the objective causal connection of the natural process. Secondly, in a subjective connection, which exists only in relation to the individual who experiences it, and which is thus as subjective as his own dreams. That both kinds of connection exist simultaneously, and the selfsame event, although a link in two totally different chains, nevertheless falls into place in both, so that the fate of one individual invariably fits the fate of the other, and each is the hero of their own drama, while simultaneously figuring in a drama foreign to them. This is something that surpasses our powers of comprehension and can only be conceived as possible by virtue of the most wonderful pre-established harmony.
Right. So we could very easily talk about Jordan and my relationship in the context of this paragraph, in the sense that I certainly had a very causal connection in all the phases of my life. My joining the Marine Corps, my going to law school, all those things were various synchronicities that fell into place. For example, when I left college, I had no idea whatsoever of going to law school. I was actually hired by Chase Manhattan Bank to become a banker, and they agreed to hold the position for me until after I had served my 3 years in the Marines of active duty, because they thought I had potential, right? But then in Vietnam, I ended up living in the same hut for the last 3 months with 3 lawyers, the chief trial counsel, the chief defense counsel, and the judge, the military judge. There's no conflict of interest in that hut.
Yeah.
But the one thing that they were all interested in was getting me to go to law school. And so we're going to be hiding this. Here we got somebody who is trying to use us, so we're going to get rid of this person. And so he won't be there. And Patrick says, I might sub for this school next to me. I think it would be enlightening and extremely fun. And in many ways it is, Patrick. And in my county, and my county is the 46th largest school district in the country, we have 125 schools in the public school system and 84,000 students. So it may not necessarily be possible to be sure you're going to sub in one specific school. I guess I had that right to put that preference in, but I'm driving all over our county learning new highways and byways. Okay, so going on, but the point was that, things happened in my life that were unpredictable. For example, just the experience of not particularly liking practicing law. I did it for 8 years, and I very much enjoyed going to law school, but I just detested practicing law. And I could not have predicted that, but I found my way out of it as quickly as I possibly could. And I went to business school while I was practicing law. I did it for 3 years, and then I went to business school. So I practiced 2 more years, a total of 5 years. But the last 2, I was on my way out because I really didn't like practicing law. And I went into business and really enjoyed that very much. And that's how most of my career went. But what I didn't know is that people cheat in business, and they cheat big time. And so things happened that were ungood. And one of the things that I needed was Jungian psychology to hold my psyche together so I wouldn't go crazy, because I thought in some ways one could think, oh geez, I was a failure in life, but oh geez, I was, intended to do this depth study of Jungian psychology, which I've done for the last 35 years now. And this is truly my calling, not other things. And the fact that Jordan and I have had an affinity with one another, I'm sure if once I shut up, Jordan can give you all the things that for him led to this moment. But nonetheless, here's a moment where we're both fated to be here doing this class at this point in time and in our lives. And I think it's very appropriate, and it's a strong message for Jungian psychology. I'm going to excuse myself, though, Jordan, because I'll make a call of nature. I think I might have heard your story, but please give it, okay?
Well, certainly. And I laugh that I was an architect for 30 years, but I laugh even more. I felt like my career was over before I even got out of college. I had worked for an architect after school and high school, and then in summers, several summers in college. And then lo and behold, when I was 19, just at the end of the first year, actually into the second year, I was home for summer break, and I was nominated to be put as a voting member on a design review committee at our church. Now, I didn't understand the politics behind what was happening. And I did know that my boss was the primary ecclesiastical structure architect in the whole region. And what's interesting, though, is the backstory is that in 1957 and 1956, my dad and this other gentleman were both on the state championship football team. They were both all-state senders. And in that sense, I think there was a feud that was silent that started there, where the other person kind of never left high school in terms of their mentality, and my dad couldn't care less about it. Well, that gentleman was the person who had nominated me to that committee. Well, I was 19. I didn't understand about conflict of interest. I didn't understand about the gray areas and how people cheat by making other people cheat on their own so that there's no blame that they receive. But imagine then what came fast to consciousness when I'm sitting there in this room, and I hadn't mentioned it to my boss because it didn't seem of any note. This is just an extracurricular volunteer place in my life. And then, of course, the door opens and he walks in to do his presentation for this addition to the church. So I didn't understand about conflict of interest. I didn't understand that the person who had it out for my dad and couldn't put one over on my dad chose me, the 19-year-old son, to make me put it over on myself. So when I'm sitting there as a voting member on the fellowship hall committee at church for the design review committee, imagine how quickly I grokked conflict of interest when my boss of years at that point in summers and after school walked in to do quote unquote our presentation. I mean, I saw rage in his eyes. I saw the betrayal that I was certainly just about to feel. And then, you know, that afternoon I left and I went back to the office, and of course I was fired. Well, like, you don't have wife, you don't have kids, and it's time for you to learn this lesson. I know more than you do about this, but you're out of here. Well, that was my first mentor. And to be crushed, I'm 19, I'm in college, and it took a year for me to kind of come back. But my career in architecture was almost over before it started, before I even left college. So that someone cheats by getting someone else to cheat for them. This is someone who couldn't put something over on my dad, so they put it over on me, the naive 19-year-old. And I think the synchronicity of that, though, is that for my career, I could smell that in a room, and I could single out people. And so that event was carried through as a showing someone else's synchronicity that's occurring so that they won't have to go through it. And they're blind to it, blind to the yellow car, so to speak. And to show them this is happening over there with those three, and just make sure you watch it, or, you know, knock them off the table, so to speak. And so the synchronicity of that, I think that one little betrayal piece is no little betrayal piece, because no betrayal is little. But what it taught me is betrayal comes from within. So the whole idea of keep your friends close and your enemies closer, the reason is your enemies can't betray you. They already don't like you. There is no betrayal possible. But when they part, like Moses in the Red Sea, then you have incoming quote unquote friendlies. And so when your enemies part, you can see they're letting in the betrayal. And so you're never blindsided after that.
Yeah.
Never maybe too strong of a word, but I think the synchronicities of understanding how that fin is going to function in quote unquote my ocean, you know, forever after that was important.
Absolutely. What to say?
So I think the synchronicity between our careers, as it were, that was Acausal. You know, that I got blindsided. It just came in out of nowhere. And if it came in out of nowhere to me, it didn't come out of nowhere to everybody else. And the fact that some would sit around silent, understanding exactly what was about to happen. And that's a complicit, omissive taking of a side, as it were. And so I think in this, the synchronicity, that lesson was make sure you have your heart in it, because it can hurt and to follow what you think you should do. And before you put your heart into it, test the waters.
Well, okay. So meanwhile, we have some questions here. One from Anders says, is synchronicity related to individuation according to Jung? And I would say definitely so, because the synchronicities that came to me that brought me into Jung are so amazing that, you know, and yet they definitely are part of my individuation as well. And
and I think to respond to that question too, the synchronicities kind of compose the weather W-E-A-T-H-E-R in the psyche
Right.
that we learn from to individuate with.
Yeah. And Anders further says, nowadays I would think of myself as a failure if I would cheat, because from a holistic perspective, I am a part of the cheating, so to speak. I will look more into individuation. Sometimes, there are times, I wouldn't say that every rule is not to be broken, and certainly that one, because sometimes cheating is in the cards, and it has a purpose in some occasions. However, I think that we're about to see how the mighty can fall in the case of Donald Trump, who has been cheating his whole life. And, the result of that is finally going to come around and bite him very severely. And
I think context has to do with it too, because if I just look at the idea of bait and switch, then, in contracts, well, that's lying. But in football, bait and switch is I'm going to get you to go this direction so I can run right around you. Mm-hmm. And so it's getting someone else to move, which is interesting to me, because then the football, you get a touchdown. Oh, how cool. Look at that. It's a good thing. And then in business, the bait and switch was a criminalized lie, as it were.
Right. And so anyway, I guess I read up to pre-established harmony, right?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I'll continue this paragraph. In his view, the subject of the great dream of life is but one, the transcendental will, the prima causa, from which all causal chains radiate with like meridian lines from the poles, and because of the circular parallels, stand to one another in a meaningful relationship of simultaneity. Schopenhauer believed in the absolute determinism of the natural process, and further in a first cause. There is nothing to warrant either assumption. The first cause is a philosophical mythologem, which is only credible when it appears in the form of the old paradox, which I can't read it.
Devropau.
Yeah, as unity and multiplicity at once. The idea that the simultaneous points in the causal chains or meridians represent meaningful coincidences would only hold water if the first cause really were a unity, but if it were a multiplicity, which is just as likely, then Schopenhauer's whole explanation collapses, quite apart from the fact which we have only recently realized, that natural law possesses a mere statistical validity and thus keeps the door open to indeterminism. Neither philosophical reflection nor experience can provide an evidence for the regular occurrence of these two kinds of connection, in which the same thing is both subject and object. Schopenhauer thought and wrote at the time when causality held sovereign sway as a category a priori and had therefore to be dragged in to explain meaningful coincidences. But as we have seen, it can do this with some degree of probability only if we have recourse to other equally arbitrary assumption of the unity of the first cause. It then follows as a necessity that every point on a given meridian stands in a relationship of meaningful coincidence to every other point in the same degree of latitude. This conclusion, however, goes far beyond the bounds of what is empirically possible, for it predicts meaningful coincidences with occurring so regularly and systematically that their verification would be either unnecessary or the simplest thing in the world. Schopenhauer's examples carry as much or as little conviction as all the others. Nevertheless, it is to his credit that he saw the problem and understood that there are no facile ad hoc explanations. Since this problem is concerned with the foundations of our epistemology, he derived it in accordance with the general trend of his philosophy from a transcendental premise, from the will which creates life and being on all levels, and which modulates each of these levels in such a way that there are only in harmony with their synchronous parallels, but also prepare and arrange future events in the form of fate or providence. Okay, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, especially with the foundations of our epistemology, first off, epistemology is the science of how we come to know things. And so in a sense, it's pre-cognizant, but not being, I see something before it happens. It's that which lies behind something that is a structure that makes it happen. So what comes to mind, though, is the riddle of context with these meridians. If I look at the globe, latitude and longitude, and if I say, if you travel 30 miles south and 30 miles west and 30 miles north, and you end up in the same spot, where are you? And that riddle is then the North Pole, because you go 30 miles south and you're going down the globe, 30 miles west, and 30 miles north is right back to the same spot. You have that little triangle. Whereas if I'm in the middle of Ecuador and I go 30 miles south and 30 miles west and 30 miles north, I'm at quite a distance between where I started and where I am now. So I think the context of how these synchronicities come into play is important there with that North Pole riddle. How does this land in your life, and does it give you a sense of direction or a sense of distance? And it's interesting to me that may be oversimplified, but with the science of how we know things, I think it brings in context is of utmost importance as to where you place one of these things. Right. Whether I place myself in the middle of Ecuador to go 30 miles south, west, and then north again, or on the North Pole.
Well, I think it might be interesting to, that's a fine geometrical fact that you gave us just then, but I think we might think of it in another way, which is, when we're training Navy and Marine Corps officers at the Naval Academy or Army officers at West Point, we're training them in the same way as we have been training them for the last 150 years, pretty much. They're not significant. There's only a dime's worth of difference between how we were training them then and how we're training them now, possibly with the exception of new information in their fields. But nonetheless, by doing that training, we find true north. In other words, when an officer is put in a position, male or female, regardless of specialty, when they're put in a position that they have to be a hero, they are a hero, typically. When they have to lead, they lead. And so, there is, it's like iron filings from a magnet. They'll always point in a certain way if you train them properly. And so, my midshipmen, we actually had 10 of them, but the first one we had is the one that's the squadron commander out on Westpac deployment right now. He, when he came to the Naval Academy at age 19, he was very rebellious. And so he first wanted to make sure that he could keep flying. And the Naval Academy has a flying club, in fact, where, midshipmen who have pilot's licenses could fly. and they know how to behave when they're in the air. So even though he was a rebellious young man at age 19, he today would be very much like Tom Skerritt in the movie Top Gun. And and so even though at 19 he was rebellious, in that year, which was 1998, I wanted to take him to the Marine Corps birthday ball that year when he was a plebe at the Naval Academy. And I wanted to get a new dress blue uniform so I would look good at the event. And so since he was flying, I said, well, let's fly down to Quantico, Marine Corps Air Station, Quantico, which is also where the basic school is, but it's also where OCS is, and there's a Marine Corps Air Station there. Well, so we decide to fly over there, and we get to a certain point in the sky, and we call into Marine Corps Air Station Quantico and say, can we land? And they say, we're very, they didn't say they were very suspicious, but they said, who are you and what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm a plebe at the Naval Academy and I have an 05 with me. And we're coming to Quantico to get a uniform. And so you could see that the air traffic control at Quantico was very suspicious. Well, there's a reason for that, and that is that the headquarters of HMX-1, which is the president's helicopters, is at Quantico, and they have a very serious security issue that they have to protect the president's helicopters and so on. And so they said, after about 20 minutes, they came back to us and said, well, fly past the tower out in the middle of the Potomac so that we can see you. And we had already confirmed that we were in a military aircraft. It said U.S. Army on the side, actually. And so they saw we were in a military aircraft, and so they allowed us to land. And we had to go in through all this security, but ultimately they allowed us to land. We walked down to the Marine shop where I could get my uniform and came back. And ever since then, I've thought, oh my God. But here, this young man, even though quite rebellious, and even though only a month and a half into his Naval Academy experience, was quite disciplined about how he approached the air traffic control at Marine Corps Air Station so that we convinced them that we should be allowed to land there. And I'm sure they don't just let any
right.
Tom, Dick, and Harry land there. And so we landed, we went and got the uniform, we came back and got in our plane and flew away. And that was all there was to it. But the first time that he was taken for a flight in an F-18, and this was in like his junior year, summer after junior year, the pilot gave him control of the airplane at one point, and the first thing he did was flip it 360 degrees. The pilot says, whoa, where did that come from? And, today I'm sure as a squadron commander, I'm sure he would never, think it was a good idea for his squadron officers to pull such a stunt, but he got away with it at that time. Very interesting. But
I think both those stories go into kind of the set up, and arrange, prepare future events for the fate or providence. And that going back to both the context of the North Pole example, and then the context of the pause along the process of from going from where you took off to where you land. There's that uncertainty piece in the middle of we're just going to get a uniform. How complex can it be? Well, we can make it this complex. It's better than driving. I mean,
it was better than driving. I must say it's only a 20-minute flight over there, but you have to, in order to get over there, you have to go through Andrews Air Force Base airspace, and so it was quite interesting. Andrews says the military is very good at making people behave, probably because of lots of experience with keeping people in line, no pun intended. Well, certainly, and I was shocked yesterday. I read an article that said that it was talking about the state of education in our country, and it said that only 23% of all those people who try to join the U.S. military, whether out of high school or whatever, only 23% are accepted. And that is a shocking number. And apparently the Army is having a lot of trouble recruiting right now. The Navy and Marine Corps are pretty much up to standard because the Marines always have more people wanting to become Marines than can. And the same with the Navy, but the Army is currently having a lot of problems recruiting. And, when you think about it, what the U.S. military does is give you a lot of free education and experience in very complicated fields. And it's really desirable to have that experience. And people don't understand that that's very much to be had. And, even my experiences in the military on active duty were incredibly valuable to me, even though when I went to artillery school, I was the top Marine in my class. And the result of that was that I never had to touch another artillery piece in my whole career. And yet, I learned so much in that artillery school about the way life works that, I can't even begin to tell you. And so that training is exceptionally valuable to young people if they can have it. But apparently a lot of young people are coming out of high school and they've had behavior problems, all kinds of stuff. And so they don't take them, they don't accept them. That's shocking. Because, even in the worst of Vietnam, when things were really bad, your chances of death or of being severely wounded were very small. About 4% of all the second lieutenants who went to Vietnam, 1 in 25 was killed in Vietnam, only one in 25. But meanwhile, all those young men who had that experience did, extremely well. And I have another interloper here. So anyway, okay, go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, to go through these examples, to come back to, how is this preparing and arranging future events in the form of fate or providence? And I think what it does is it's setting you in motion for perspective, that no matter where you are, the unconscious can well up contents and you can put them to use or not. And so it's the whole adage of don't believe everything you think. Right. Well, the unconscious is not so much thinking, but it is permeating the thought theater, as it would be, to stay with the military example. And that thought theater has the spaces in between that is filled by these potential contents. And so I think what happens is that's where it's, with their synchronous parallels, but also prepare and arrange future events in the form of fate or providence, it colors your perspective.
Yeah.
So the unconscious can train you, and understanding that sometimes it's about the not knowing And sometimes it's no, this is simple 1, 2, 3, just right along with.
I want to thank Miles Flagg for writing herd here on our YouTube chat, because we've had a couple of interlopers here today, and they're trying to mess with my chat. So I've been catching them as they came up, but Miles is even quicker than me. So I just marked them as hide from this site, but Miles gets credit for having gotten them before I got to them. So
he's out on point. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles, for doing that. And it's good to know that you're out there. Right. And, and it really, part of my point is that it really doesn't matter who it is. I mean, there's a scene in the movie Zulu that's very interesting, where there are two British Army second lieutenants in a battle, and they're surrounded by 5,000 Zulu. It's also an event that was written up in Robert Michener's book called The Covenant. Robert Michener is about South Africa, but in this particular event, there's two second lieutenants. One is an infantry officer, and the other one is like a accountant or something like that. But the accountant has seniority over the infantry officer by 1 month. He's 1 month senior to the infantry officer, and so he demands to be in command. And in the event, he does quite well. And at that time, the Zulu didn't have rifles or any weapons, and the British Army had, I guess, Gatling guns at that point. And so even though they were surrounded by 5,000 Zulu, there ended up being 5,000 dead Zulu around them at the end of this battle, which was obviously quite shocking to the Zulu. But in any case, it's an interesting piece in the movie.
Well, that reminds me of the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. When you get
right.
the bottle drops out of the sky and hits him in the head, and then a series of chain of events that proceed from there. I mean, the gods must be crazy is a really good way to describe the unconscious.
Right now, Anders makes the comment, I wonder if the military has special knowledge of psychology because of all their experience with managing people in very controlled manner. And I remember when I told the Chase Manhattan officer that I was going to go on active duty in the Marine Corps, he said, go ahead and have good luck to you, because we call that management experience here. And of course it is, because all of a sudden you're 21 years old and you're in command of 50 other Marines in your platoon who are 17, 18, 19 typically. And the 20-year-old is a staff sergeant or a gunnery sergeant. And at 21, you're the old man. And but at 21, you're also the man with the knowledge, because the military gives the officers knowledge about how to call in airstrikes and artillery strikes and all sorts of things. And they don't teach that to a rifleman. So the riflemen are entirely dependent upon those officers to be able to get them out of trouble if they have to.
Well, that management experience is a really good example, because I remember presenting a project at one point to a client, and they were just having none of it. And then I go back to the office, and my boss at the time says, so how'd it go? I said, they were having none of it, not a single piece of it. He goes, he made a call. He walks out the door, goes back. He asked me what I said, and so he goes there and he said exactly just about the same thing I said.
Mm-hmm.
And he did exactly the same things I did. He drew exactly the same things I drew. And they're like, oh, we love this. Thank you. What it was the bang for the buck. They wanted the old man to tell them. They didn't want the young guy he sent out to tell them. They wanted, top brass, as it were.
Yeah.
And when he said the same thing I did, when we got back in the car and started driving back to the office, I went, but you did exactly what I did. And he goes, sometimes they just need to hear the old man say it.
Right.
And that's interesting, because that's the management experience piece, where they just thought I might be getting lucky, or who knows what they thought, but they wanted the money, the bang for the buck of, well, I paid for the principal. I want the principal.
Right. Right. So Anderson says, Hollywood director, I don't remember who, said that making large movies is similar to how a military operates, complex management of lots of people. And, it's, very helpful to have that kind of experience because, for example, it may look like I'm on the rocks from a business perspective because I haven't appeared to be in business for many years, and yet I've stayed active with a group in Malaysia, and something big may come of that at some point over the next year. Now, about 2 years ago, my colleague, 2.5 years ago, my colleague said, oh, we can pay you X number of dollars a month, which he did for about 18 months. And then it slowed down to a trickle. And finally, no money is coming through. It's not because it won't come through, but because it's a little slower than you expect to get a pilot project going. So I finally came to the position where I had to go out and get some substitute teaching to make ends meet around my household here. But I don't begrudge that because, in the end, what a great story it will make when I can say that we achieved this thing that can be amazing. And it's a relationship that I've kept going for over 20 years now. And so I'm the man on the spot in the United States for that company, and actually for 3 companies, believe it or not. And so when the worm turns and things come together, I will be the man on the spot in America again. And who knows what I can do on Sunday mornings, but but it's going to be quite an object lesson for a lot of people, I think. And that's provided I survive long enough, because I just passed my 76th birthday last week. So
happy birthday again.
Yeah. So it's a collection of experiences, and it includes the military, it includes the law, it includes business experience and business school, and all those experiences are coming together in a certain way that either it's going to have a huge result for the family or nothing at all. You have to pay your money and take your chances. So you want to read 829.
Sure. In contrast to Schopenhauer's accustomed pessimism, this utterance has an almost friendly and optimistic tone, which we can hardly sympathize with today. One of the most problematical and momentous centuries the world has ever known separates us from that still medievalistic age when the philosophizing mind believed it could make assertions beyond what could be empirically proved. It was an age of large views, which did not cry halt and think that the limits of nature had been reached just where the scientific road builders had come to a temporary stop. Thus, Schopenhauer, with true philosophical vision, opened up a field for reflection whose particular phenomenology he was not equipped to understand, though he outlined it more or less correctly. He recognized that with their omnia and praesagia, astrology, and the various intuitive methods of interpreting fate have a common denominator which he sought to discover by means of transcendental speculation. He recognized equally rightly that it was a problem of principle of the first order, unlike all those before and after him who operated with futile conceptions of some kind of energy transmission or conveniently dismissed the whole thing as nonsense in order to avoid a too difficult task. And he says in the footnote, here I must make an exception of Kant, whose treatise Dreams and Spiritual Seer, illustrated by Dreams of Metaphysics, pointed the way for Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's attempt is more remarkable in that it was made at the same time when the tremendous advance of the natural sciences had convinced everybody that causality alone could be considered the final principle of explanation. Instead of ignoring all those experiences, which refused to bow down to the sovereign rule of causality, he tried, as we have seen, to fit them into his deterministic view of the world. In so doing, he forced concepts like prefiguration, correspondence, and pre-established harmony, which as a universal order coexisting with the causal one, have always underlain man's explanations of nature into the causal scheme, probably because he felt, and rightly, that the scientific view of the world based on natural law, though he did not doubt its validity, nevertheless lacked something which played a considerable role in the classical and medieval view, in parentheses, as it also does in the intuitive feelings of modern man.
Right. So, this is the idea that there must be something that is causal and is causing everything in the universe. And the issue with that is that now, with all of our science, it takes us back to the Big Bang. And, all of science can't explain that. They can name it as a singularity. But after calling it a singularity, then you have to ask yourself, where did all these galaxies with billions and billions of stars, where could they actually have been in a singularity? And
well, that calls into notion just the concept of time, because even if you get back to the Big Bang, well, what caused the Big Bang? And then
that's the point. Yeah.
The no beginning, no end it makes more and more and more and more sense that what has always been, what is has always been, what will be has always been. So with the Big Bang, well, what was before that? But the problem is you get into quite a rabbit hole of no loopholes, except it's all composed of loopholes. You just gotta
that's one. Right. So we can put a lot of information together and make it work for us, but we can't necessarily explain the origin and the cause. Right. I need to call a halt here because my wife behind me is about to begin an important teaching, and right. I need to let her do that.
Hello, ladies.
So I'm going to stop at the end of 8:29. We'll begin on 8:30 next week, and next week I'll be better at putting up these readings so that you can get so that everybody can see the reading as we're reading it. I think it'll be a little clearer that way. But this last point is quite important, and I had marked it several years ago when I read this the first time, and so even though I now have the unique book, I have it in my possession, but it is the same, and so I'm going back to volume 8 of the collected works, which you can find in our Dropbox
It's cold here,
under
though. I don't
collected
know
works,
about everywhere else.
and go down to the bottom.
Suddenly
You'll
we
find
dropped
the
it.
volumes of the collected works of C.G. Young. Okay, thanks, Jordan. See you next
Oh,
week.
See you next week.
Yeah,
Yes.
good luck with with your work today.
Thank you.
Take care now. Bye-bye.